So we're just going to call up then and prepare Luzanne and her team for panel 1. And then afterwards, we'll move on swiftly to the remarks from Professor Mutwa, and then we'll move over then to panel 2. So Luzanne, over to you then.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Luzanne. Thank you. Sorry for that. So my name is Luzanne Kutsia, and I'm from the University of the Free State. Firstly, I would just like to thank you for the honor of chairing the first panel. I'm very excited. So for the first panel, we're going to talk some rugby. And without further ado, I want to introduce Mr. Mark Fredericks. He is a lab technician at the University of Walter Sisulu, and his abstract that he's going to discuss with us today is entitled Images That Lie, the portrayal of the Springbok, which is the rugby team in South Africa, in mainstream media. Mark, please tell us more. And I would just like to tell you that you have 15 minutes to do so. Thank you.
Start video. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Luzanne. Thank you, everyone, for this opportunity. Yeah, well, just in the opening remarks here by the welcome and Professor Simon Akindis, already there some of my argument points have been made. Somebody mentioned there that the pandemic highlighted the inequalities in South Africa or in the world. But I would argue that the absence of top flight sport during the pandemic shifted the focus to the inequalities that exist in the world. It was not the pandemic that highlighted it. It's just the pandemic forced us to focus on that because there was no top flight sport. There was no distraction. And then also, Professor Akindis, in his tribute to Lee Evans, said that the athlete cannot just stay in their lane. The athlete is supposed to engage with society because very few people actually get the opportunity to win medals and all those accolades. And in the tribute to Lee Evans, there was made mention of the long line of sporting activists right through the 1968 Olympics and so on. Now that is precisely what I look at when I look at the lie that is being spread through the mainstream media about the Springboks. And first, we have to define what is the truth and what is a lie. A truth obviously is rooted in reality, it's rooted in fact, and it is evidence-based. But new media has actually muddied or clouded the perception of reality because we've had films based on reality, based on historical events and based on historical figures that are total nonsense. One that I can mention is the film Inglourious Bastards by Quentin Tarantino, which shows how Hitler was killed in a theater in Paris. And not too long ago, I asked students a few questions about Adolf Hitler, and many of them actually believed that Hitler was in fact killed in a theater in Paris. So the reading of history is reserved for a very select few of people. It's people who are interested in history and people who spend their time analyzing the various data and documents of history, the artifacts and so on. And the other movie, of course, relates to this the American Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, Vampire Killer or Vampire Hunter. Those are actual historical figures, but they are presented in a totally frivolous way. Now, a lie is deception. It's false information or decontextualized information, and it's fabricated. So lying then requires a motive. It requires an agenda. And you have to ask, why lie? Okay. So Dr. Emma Williams from the University of Cardiff actually says that the liar must decide not to tell the truth and then to assert an alternative statement that is plausible. So that is what lying is all about and how it contests the truth. So when I look at the springbok, we've got to understand, is not a social institution. It is a commercial institution. It is a commercial brand, and it is reliant on its image and the representation of its image within the media. So that brand has got to be protected at all costs. Does not matter what happens, you protect the brand. So in the post-apartheid era, I think it was around about 2009, 2007, we saw a number of Springboks being inducted into the World Rugby Hall of Fame. One of them being Barry Heatley, who was inducted in 2009. And you have Benny Osler, who was inducted in 2009. You have Dani Craven, who was inducted in 2007. Dani Gerber was inducted in 2015. And you have Nas Botha, also inducted in 2015. There were a few others. Now, none of these Springboks ever played under the new South African flag. But all of them have been inducted into the World Rugby Hall of Fame under the new flag. They did not nominate themselves. They were nominated by the brand owners to be inducted. Now, the only figure who fought against apartheid, who stands alongside them in the World Rugby Hall of Fame, is Nelson Mandela. None of the victims of apartheid who contested apartheid through sport and through rugby appear in the World Rugby Hall of Fame. So, which brings up the question, what happened? Why were these men nominated who were beneficiaries of the system of racial exclusion, while those who fought that system were not nominated? So there already we have a few images that are telling a mistruth. So what you're having is you have power being spoken, mistruth is being spoken to the powerless through these images. And because of the power of this image, the power of the Springbok brand, the Springbok came into being. They became the Springboks. They became the new South African symbol of unity and what South Africans can achieve when they are united is because of careful management of their image in the post-unity era. So their exploits on the field of play reminds us of what can be achieved if we put our minds to it. But that very statement is also false because it does not fully inform the public that every resource imaginable is given to these highly paid athletes. Their salaries are secret. They get placed into various tiers of payment and salary payments and sponsorship deals and so on. And all of this is very secretive. So every single resource you can think of, nutritional, psychological, financial, you name it, these guys get, which is why, that is partly why they can achieve what they achieve, which the very resources that are denied ordinary South Africans. Service delivery is a mess. Education is a mess. Our health systems are in a mess. So, you know, you've got to, in echoing what Professor Kinder said, You know, we cannot just look at what these guys achieve on the fields of play. So their apartheid legacies are downplayed. And it has to be downplayed because the brand could become damaged. And the anti-apartheid brand in rugby cannot stand alongside it because the two are not compatible. One fought apartheid and racism, and the other one is a beneficiary of those very policies. So the distasteful side of Springbok history has become decontextualized over time. And the images of Nelson Mandela and the victories and the achievements on the field allows for the brand owners to perform a sort of visual ventriloquism through their brand. The brand now speaks on their behalf about their values, and the image is therefore able to misinform the people about what is actually happening in terms of its historical context. So the image therefore relies on the preconceptions and the experiences, the knowledge that we have or ordinary people have about what is being presented. And if you are not somebody who is interested in what happens in Sports Africa and read these sports journals and reads the sports history books, if you are not one of those people and you are only interested in what happens on the scoreboard, then you will easily follow these trends within the media, because it becomes very, very easy then for this visual shorthand to a happier time, a euphoric time when the Springboks lifted the World Cup for the first time. It then becomes very easy for that to take place and to happen. So we have to be careful about how, by we, I shouldn't say we, I say, let's say SA Rugby has to be careful about how it presents its history to the general public in terms of rugby. So the anti-apartheid side of the story is rarely, if ever, told within the context of Springbok existence. And what has happened now with the COVID-19 pandemic is, with the absence of top flight sport the world over, we have suddenly seen people genuflecting. Colin Kaepernick and the others mentioned, John Carlos, Tommy Smith, all of these chaps, and even here in South Africa, our Sali Frederikses, our Kassim Jabars, and these people have been raising their fists in anger against apartheid for many years, for decades. Many people I know personally. But all of a sudden, it has become big business now to see these highly paid athletes genuflecting. So the Springboks do not have a history of fighting social injustice or racial injustice, yet the symbol is being viewed as being transformative and as socially acceptable. So the Rugby Springbok, as a symbol of unity and South African cohesion, relies heavily on its image post-1995. The 1995 World Cup with Chester Williams there, suddenly we had them in 2007 lifting the World Cup, and lo and behold, in 2019, they pulled off a miracle after 3 or 4 years of terrible results on the field, and they brought the World Cup home to the people. And it's a big lie. There are many little lies that support this, and in order to save time, I'm just going to give you how, I just made a note here of what Professor Kindi said, how normalizing inequality has taken place in the shadow of the Springbok. Let's look at the opening scene of Invictus. And unfortunately, I can't share my screen here now. I've got a few issues here. But if you look at the opening scene of Invictus, it opens up with a dark screen, Spyglass Entertainment, but in the distance you hear Shosholoza being played. In England, last year or the year before last, there was a big issue about Swing Low, Sweet Chariot being sung by England fans because of its roots within the slave movement in the USA. But Swing Low, Sweet Chariot came into the spotlight. But in South Africa, we celebrate Shosholoza because Shosholoza is the song of the Springboks. So as Invictus opens, you hear Shosholoza being sung. And instead of them saying dig, dig, digging in the sun, you hear them singing push, push, pushing in the scrum. Then you see a group of young white boys playing rugby, passing the ball, and the camera pans across the road to what looks like an informal settlement where a bedraggled group of black boys are playing soccer with a threadbare soccer ball. And then, of course, there's a cavalcade of cars that move past, and it's Nelson Mandela. That's the opening scene of Invictus. And then the coach says to the rugby coach says to his charges there, remember this day, this is the day the country went to the dogs. Now that scene was shot in Bellville. The school where it was shot was DF Milan. And DF Milan has never ever had a piece of land opposite it where an informal settlement existed. The land opposite it actually belongs to an arm of Rotary in Cape Town, and they have artistic artscape and all sorts of things happening there. So that was constructed. Now, when I saw that, and I tried to find out now, I understand the filmmaker. The filmmaker wanted to show the chasm that exists between black and white in South Africa at the time of Nelson Mandela's release. But I wanted to know more. So I looked and I found out who wrote the script. And the script was written by a South African expat by the name of Anthony Peckham, who has won numerous awards in the USA. He left South Africa many years ago for his script writing. And his script actually describes that scene, virtually word for word, in the way it happened visually in the film. Now, my thinking is, where did Anthony Peckham see why did he construct such an elaborate ruse to show that here's an elite school, white boys playing rugby, black boys playing soccer, further entrenching the idea that soccer is the black man's game, rugby is the white man's game. It is as plain as day when you see it. But then you look at the television adverts, and I'm going to stop after this example. I don't know how much time is left. I forgot to set my timer. You look at You
have about 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. You have the Love Rugby commercial. And it opens up with a shack scene. And you see a young black player. It shows the shack scene. And the next scene is Siya Kolisi. And he says, could you repeat the question? And this ad goes on. And then you see the black player leaving the shack with a rugby ball under his arm. And it sort of goes through the day in the life of the Springboks on the one hand and a young black rugby player. It shows both male and female players, one young girl even sneaking out of a township house to get to rugby practice. She's got her boots around her neck and she wants to go play rugby. Now that type of visual presentation has no shame in showing where black people belong in South Africa within the context of the Springbok. So the Springbok is not a unifying or vehicle, or a vehicle that encourages social cohesion. It is a vehicle that presents itself as a civilizer of the uncivilized. Because from the shack, if you do your due diligence, you can become a Springbok. That is what the visual message is. And those are the lies that I've been following. I've done a lot more work on it, but unfortunately, 15 minutes is not enough. And I think I'll stop there, Luzanne, and I hope I've made sense. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mark. We can hear your passion through your work, and that's really fantastic to hear. I'm sure you will be able to discuss more throughout the Q&A. But without further ado, we're going to talk about that exact World Cup in 2019 that you referred to, where Parwin Patel is going to tell us more. She's a student, a PhD student, and an assistant lecturer at the University of Reunion Island. And she is going to question the impact of the 2019 World Cup victory of South Africa on the South African society, and how fractured fandom plays a role and has an impact in the country. Thank you, Parwin. You can go ahead.
Thank you very much, Lizanne, and thank you, Max, for this very nice presentation. And first of all, my sincere gratitude to Sports Africa for allowing me to make this presentation today. So without waiting more, we're just going to switch rapidly to the introduction, because I thought it was 20 minutes, but it's just 15. So I'm just going to rush through the introduction, which is quite long, I'm afraid. So rugby in South Africa has always been a burning issue ever since it was first played as a game in the 19th century. The oval ball was equally adopted by the white and the non-white population during the colonial period. It was played and contested along racial lines, as Mark just told us. He's just told us that. White and non-white groups had their respective clubs and union, though non-white rugby organizations were virtually open to any player, regardless of their skin color. In reality, players of European origins, English and Boers, of course, on one hand, and players from other origins, on the other hand, hardly ever mingled. By the beginning of the 20th century, and perhaps more precisely after the 1903 British and Lion tours of South Africa and the 1906 visit of the white and Springbok team to the British Isles, rugby became the preeminent South African national winter game. Yet until rugby officially became a professional sport in 1995, it seems to have only been known as a white man's preserve, as most historical accounts still point out today. It almost took a century for South African historians to acknowledge that Black rugby history was untaught. For instance, you may see Andre Odendaal's The Thing That Is Not Round, 1995, written with Albert Franling and Burger Spies. Up to now, this war is still far from being filled. In fact, apart from Manny Boule's Forgotten Heroes, published in 1998, which deals with the history of Black rugby from 1882 to 1992, the book's title indicates very little has been published about non-white rugby. And perhaps there was a feeling back in the 1990s, after the main rugby bodies, mainly the South African Rugby Board and the South African Rugby Union, when they reunited in 1992 as one national rugby union, that from then on, one common history of rugby could be written. However, the fact that there was 3 years later only one Black player in the 1995 Springbok squad shatters this idea into pieces. For former non-racial groups, this was quite hard to understand, but for the mainstream media, it was easy to explain. Each racial group seemingly hold on distinctive sports, rugby for the whites and soccer for the Black people. This myth was widely spread both on national and international level. On May 20, 1995, an Associated Press television report even mentioned that the irony is that while South Africa is a majority Black country, all but Chester William is white. Instead, soccer is a favored sport among Black South Africans. The legacy of racial segregation has also meant that there are very few adequate sports facilities for Black youth. Well, a little more than a month later, on June 24, 1995, the South African rugby team, led by Francois Pienaar, won their first World Cup on home soil, with the strong support of then President Nelson Mandela, who had expressly asked his fellow countrymen to stand behind them because they are our pride. And this 1995 World Cup has since been analysed, evaluated and re-examined in various angles, but it is very difficult not to admit that the Mandela miracle helped this Mandela miracle helped a lot to make the Springbok team a symbolic illustration of the ideal rainbow nation and the new South Africa. 25 years later, and the Springboks got hold of the Webb Ellis for the first time. 25 years after, the Springboks got hold of the Webb Ellis for the first time. Eyewitnesses, such as Scottish journalist Neil Drysdale, still evokes the 1995 World Cup as a symbol of how sport can transform attitudes and even influence history. Notwithstanding, 2 years after rugby has supposedly become a nation building tool, the sport minister of Mandela's cabinet, Steve Tshwete, declared that was disenchantment and anger in his country, insisting on the fact that the moment of unity in South Africa was lost because Black rugby players were not breaking through the racial glass ceiling and they were nowhere to be found in the national rugby team. Threats and sanctions were then imposed on the South African Rugby Union so that it would transform itself and allow more Black players to represent their country at elite level. But as it was not enough for rugby selectors to field non-white players, the government of Jacob Zuma eventually resorted to sport quotas after passing a transformation charter for South African sports in 2011. 3 years later, the South African Rugby Union presented its controversial strategic transformation plan, known as STP, which aim was to have a minimum of 50% of Black players in the Springbok squad by 2019. Needless to say, this sparked once again a nationwide and international debate on the nature of the South African rugby team when it went to compete and eventually secured its third rugby title in 2019. Well, in this context, we seek to examine how this 2019 Springbok squad is an embodiment of this enduring dynamic between unity and conflict as exposed by Donald and Colony in 2016 between mainstream opinion and marginalized voices. Based on qualitative resources, newspaper, archives, political insight, and quantitative data, our presentation will first focus on the South African political responses to the World Cup title, and then we will look at the impact of this sporting victory at a community level. So first of all, let's get to the first part, the presidential evaluation of the Springboks win based on the team's transformation. 2 days after the final whistle of Rugby World Cup 2019 on September 2nd, 2019, and the Springboks were crowned Rugby World Champions for the third time in their history. And the South African president, Cyril Ramaphosa, wrote an e-letter to South African in which he takes the opportunity to link the Springboks win to affirmative action measures, also known as transformation and Black economic empowerment in South Africa, while stating that Saturday was a triumphant day as it confirmed that we are, as a nation, firm in its resolve to find unity in its diversity and as exemplified in our national rugby team, which is transforming beautifully, being presented to the world with its first Black captain. Ramaphosa considered that the Springboks have finally become a beacon of the plural South African society and present his nation as a physical and successful entity. Yet he also admits that there is much more that we need to do to make this a country where the Black child and white child can attain the heights they always dream of. In other words, President Ramaphosa explicitly recognizes that the struggle for equal access to elite rugby is still on, even though he does not hint at the problematic representation of the South African racial categories and national rugby team. Through this letter, he subtly underlines that the very fact that the Weber list was lifted by the first Black captain, which is incidentally repeated twice, epitomizes the transformation of a sport that was one racially segregated. Moreover, the word transform, transformation, and the verb to transform peppies the presidential piece of writing, and this clearly shows Ramaphosa's will to prove that his political party's transformation policies has been fruitful. Yet, if we look at the data provided by the South African Rugby Union, which indicates that only 352 players have been selected for the Springboks in the 26 years since unification, of whom 77 are Black, remarkably, 25% of them, 20, have been selected in just 4 years since the inception of the Strategic Transformation Plan in 2015. So it appears that transformation seems a pipe dream. It means that since 1992, there have been only 21% non-white players among the Springboks. It is therefore difficult to concede that rugby's transformation is reached beyond the fact that a Black captain was appointed for the first time in South African rugby history since rugby is controlled by one sole union. So moreover, if it took more than a year for Mandela's cabinet to realize that the Springboks did not mirror the South African society, it was only 10 days after the 2019 World Cup that the Springboks became the subject of lively debates between South African members of parliament. Indeed, during the plenary session of the National Assembly on November 12, 2019, politicians from the two main political parties, ANC and Democratic Alliance, most of them wearing the green and gold jersey, paid tributes in turn to the national rugby team, while the EFF MPs, the economic freedom fighters, were adamant they would not eulogize the Springboks. So we have an example here of the two opposite discourses of MPs in the assembly. This short but intense exchange of ideas between MPs underlines that the 2019 Rugby World Champions failed to bring all the South African political parties together around the national rugby team, not only because of a lack of Black representation in the squad, but also on the ground that the Springboks still represent colonialism. In order to explain the divisive position that Springboks in South Africa, we may use and refer to the suggestion of Winnen Grefrat, who writes that 2 decades after democratization in South Africa's political consciousness has moved from its fixation with apartheid proper and has begun to interrogate the orthodox colonial nature of the past and for some the present. During this plenary, Ndlozi, the MP for EAF, also declared that people agree that rugby has not transformed, and it is not about to transform, because only one Makazole MPP has made it from rural rugby in the Eastern Cape, where there are more Black rugby players than the white people combined in South Africa, that Siya Kolisi had to go to a white school, otherwise he would have not seen the light day in the World Cup. Why must we rally behind people whom, when they are together, call us baboons? One of the players in this recent team, Ibn Etzebet, is facing charges of racial assault in a case led by the human rights. We therefore call on Black people to refuse the emotional abuse that the ANC government is subjecting us to. End of quote from Ndlozi. So through this statement, we can see that he actually draws attention to 2 key points which serve his depreciation of the Springboks: the backgrounds, origin of Black players, and the persistent presence of racism in the team. As it happens, he first mentioned that there is only one player, Mapipi, in the 2019 team who was able to make it from rock to riches. And this can hardly be denied. In an interview, Mapipi himself states that he's been blessed coming from a rural area and he didn't make the South African school teams. Mapipi's, in his own way, long journey inevitably contrasts with the schooling of the Springboks captain in the semi-private Grey High School, which is considered to be among the best and oldest South African educational institutions. And is it not surprising that this precise gap between the 2 Black players emerges at parliament through the voices of a political party which contends that the ANC has done enough to transform South African society? Actually, the EFF MP does not judge Black players in their sole sporting skills, but rather on their socio-economical background, which shows that it is very hard for the poor and underprivileged to find their place in the South African Rugby Union. Journally and Connolly and Dolan remarks that the contested nature of some nation means players may assume a rather temporary and emotionally tepid position in relation to international competition, as the national habitus from childhood experience emanates from different conceptions of their nation. And this is exactly what Siya Kolisi represents for major part of the South African nation. Secondly, Ndlozi highlights that a white player, Ibn Etzebet, in the 2019 Springbok squad was accused of racial harassment so shortly before he embarked for the Rugby World Cup 2019. This case was widely covered by the South African press before, during, and after the international competition in Japan. It eventually led to an internal investigation and a human commission case being opened. It also provokes several political groups' outcry and causes casing attacks against South African Rugby Union by former South African Rugby head coach Peter de Villiers, who openly declared he would not support the Springboks because the union was failing to stamp out racism. Incidentally, we should remark that it was not the only incident which sent the idealized Stronger Together campaign launched by the South African Rugby Union to bring the South African together around their national team. Indeed, in the early stages of the World Cup in October 2019, TV camera caught a video of Black player Makazole Mapipi, him again, being excluded from a group of white players known as the Bomb Squad inside the South African rugby team as they were hugging each other. Though it was immediately denied by Springboks coach Rassie Erasmus and Mapipi himself, many South Africans were hardly convinced of the explanation given to justify the fact that Mapipi was banned from the Bomb Squad gathering. These events clearly showed that the Springboks' tarnished image in South African political circles days before they became world champions also reflected on a social scale. And the views of many South Africans to the 2019 rugby team is still a symbol of white dominance, and they are critical And some people are critical that of a national rugby administration which only bring forth window dressing, as they call it, window dressing players. So that leads us to our second part. Actually, put again the number of seats in parliaments, but we're just going to skip through this. So this brings us to evoke the notion of fractured fandom as conceptualized by Caroline Reinhard and analyzed in the specific South African context by Granling and Granling, Marizan and her father Albert in 2019. The latter defines a seemingly paradoxical dimension of fans who fail to support the national team. While Granling and Granling have tried to explain why large communities in South Africa have been supporting the New Zealand team, the All Blacks, since 1960, it can be said that more generally, many South Africans have been backing any team opposing the Springboks. As former non-white rugby player Connor Broadhurst mentioned in a recent interview regarding the way he and his rugby players looked at the Springboks, he said, "We wanted anyone but them to win, because for him it was the same story every time. He was denied an opportunity to reach the national rugby team." Furthermore, for Mr. Broadhurst, he actually hints in his interview at a persistent bitterness that he feels up until today when he says that, "I'm not saying I'm a superstar, but when I watch the rugby now, I can see I'm better than some of the guys who are being selected in my position." In fact, this resentment is commonly shared by other former players and their families who not only regret that there never was a full acceptance of their sacrifices and as sportsmen deprived of elite rugby, but also think that community rugby has been completely destroyed. For Granling and Granling, this thought and support for other teams than the Springboks have been transmitted from one generation to another. Back in 1997, while Sport Minister Steve Tshwete first attempted to transform South African rugby from an apartheid symbol to an emblem of the Rainbow Nation, that was still to be built. He was conscious of this fractured fandom, as he declared, "If we in South Africa are allowed to go back to the standards of apartheid days, when the Black would support the visiting sides against the Springboks, it would be very, very sad." But that the lengthy process of transformation has been inefficient, and creating a team that is truly representative of South Africa for more than 2 decades now. It has been inevitable that South Africans who finally lost faith in affirmative action policies, or those people who did not simply approve of empowerment measures, continues to turn their back on the national rugby team of their home country. It is notable that the very quota system implemented in 2015 has added to the division of South African population regarding its rugby team. A recent Institute of Race Relation poll suggests that more than 80% of South Africans, regardless of skin color, are against the selection of sport quotas, as you can see now on the PowerPoint. It is just very difficult for the 2019 Springbok team which is not actually selected on merit, to be widely acclaimed as truly representative of South Africa. However, it cannot be denied that if for some South African it has been a burden of showing Springbok support, and I'm referring here to Francois Cléophant's statement, because of the very Springbok badge, which they still see as a colonial, segregationist, apartheid symbol for other South Africans moving from one single Black player in the 1995 team to 6 Black players in a Springbok World Cup final has been a real achievement. The state of play indicates that the 2019 Springbok team is still a divisive issue among South Africans, although the mainstream media have chosen to focus on the capacity of the team to bring South Africans together. It would be almost impossible to compare the supporter for the Springboks in 2019 with the one in 1995 because the context is so different. Yet it can be said that while there was hope among South Africans that rugby could become a tool of reconciliation back in 1995, such expectations have seemingly vanished. The 2019 Springboks squad being embedded in racial issues, as we have seen, and a nationally criticized quota system. Another major issue for this 2019 South African rugby team is in fact related to this selection method. Of course, besides the sanitary situation that Mark evoked briefly through his presentation. Though most South Africans are against the quota system, the South African Rugby Union has decided to continue its transformation with a 10-year plan now, which is called the Strategic Transformation Development Plan, and which is running until 2030. It seems to be a vivid illustration of how far the South African Rugby Union is disconnected to the demands of South African people regarding the national team. It also shows that the South African Rugby Union has become dependent of affirmative action to continue its transformation. Though the former non-white Springbok player Brian Abana hopes that Siya Kolisi's achievement may allow a new generation to aspire to achieve greatness, he encapsulates the forthcoming challenges for the next black players, given the trajectory that South African Rugby Union has chosen to follow. He says, as a player of color, you know, there is a massive responsibility on your shoulders when you have that opportunity to wear the Springbok jersey. No player of color wants to be seen as a quota player. That term quota player is so difficult to speak about because we all just want fair and equal opportunities. Given apartheid, it is extremely challenging. It is a unique situation that no other rugby playing country has to consider or worry about. If you live in a township and don't have access to facilities or to public transport, if you don't have funds available to train at rugby, it can be difficult. And it's hard to conceptualize that to people who have not been embroiled in that environment. It is a challenge that is unfortunately always going to be part of South Africa, given our history. And this is really, if we actually compare this in parallel with Siya Kolisi's statements, the actual Springbok captain, he says, I wouldn't want to be picked because of my skin color. If you want to talk transformation, you've got to start here at the lower level. Imagine if I didn't go to the English school, I wouldn't have eaten properly. I wouldn't have grown properly. So Abana's and Siya Kolisi's statements implicitly highlight that the South African Rugby Union has not come to terms with the reality of everyday life as a majority of South African, and it has clearly chosen to turn a blind eye on the difficulties non-white players have to face to reach elite rugby. Kolisi also points at the same problem which hosts rugby union in South Africa. And when the South African Rugby Union mentioned in its 2019 report that a campaign brilliantly engineered by Director of Rugby Rassie Erasmus had at its head the Springbok first black captain Siya Kolisi, who led a team representing all corners of our diverse nation, an absolute harmony today. That we live long in the history of South Africa, not just in the history of rugby. Well, it demonstrates that our union has not yet acknowledged that it cannot cling forever on a selection method and thimbles, which bring anything but harmony in all corners of South Africa. Well, to conclude, this presentation shows that the 2019 Springbok team is not only a sporting team. Not only results and scores matter for South Africans today, and as of this 2019 team has been a subject of division among political parties and people in South Africa. While the South African Rugby Union has opted under governmental pressure for a transformation policy, it has not yet proved it can foster community rugby at grassroots level and assemble a representative South African rugby team, which is relieved of its still problematic symbols that prevent the Springboks to be a true emblem of unity in the diversity of South Africa. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Parwin. It is much appreciated, and thank you for your great work. It is interesting, the perspective from somebody in South Africa, you know, hearing what somebody from outside South Africa has to say. And I think you raised a lot of very important points. We're now going to move over to our third and final speaker, Professor Derek Katzum, who is a professor in history at the University of Texas. And he's also an associate professor at Rhodes University. And he is going to reflect with us on 25 years of South African rugby from 1995 onwards. Thank you, Professor.
Hey, I don't know if I'm on the video or not. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, there we go. You can see Errol Tobias peeking from behind my head when he played the Midwestern team in the 1981 tour to the United States, which is sort of this is drawn from a lot of my work, but it's also drawn from the conclusion of that book that'll be out in September. And the good thing is that Mark and Parween have covered a lot of what I'm going to cover. So maybe I'll just say ditto and open it up for questions. I should point out that we are on the 26th anniversary today of the 1995 finals against New Zealand. So I guess the 25-year mark, which would have been so salient last year, now is just another anniversary, essentially like 5s and 10s. The other anniversary we're looking at is 4 years ago today, I was wearing my journalist hat and I was covering the Springbok France match at Ellis Park. Whatever corporate name they've given it, it'll always be Ellis Park to me. And on that night, Eben Etzebeth made his debut as Springbok captain, a very short-lived experience. And down in the press room, he walked in for his interview and he said, "Welcome to the greatest day of my life." And it was a reminder, of course, of how much the sport itself means to these guys, what it means to be a Springbok, what it meant to be a Springbok captain, which makes, of course, what has happened to Eben Etzebeth since then an interesting reflection of the complications of post 1995, really post 1992 maybe rugby in South Africa, which is to say that Eben Etzebeth had the sort of greatest experience of his life, while at the same time he's been one of the engines of some of the controversies. And we don't know what happened in Longabon, right? We're not sure. We may never know, but we know something happened. And we know that the ugly phrase or ugly word hot knot was used by someone in Etzebeth's party. And we know that it appears that he and his party anyways may have been the aggressors on this. So I think that those two sort of anniversaries of June 24th maybe provide some context to some of the things I'll talk about now. And it will be, maybe a little bit episodic because I've been doing this for so long and the conclusion's long. So I'm just going to chat my way through it. And one of the issues that I think is worth pointing out that in rugby, unlike virtually every other sport, the International Rugby Board never excluded South Africa, which is to say that it was up to individual countries to decide whether or not to exclude South Africa from participation. And ultimately what that meant was whether to play South Africa or not. And I think that the lifeline that South Africa had, in addition to the sort of idea of any port in a storm, which is what the US Tour in 1981 represented, which is what I think some of the South America games represented, was the fact that New Zealand, at least in 1981, would continue to play South Africa. And I think that's a really important component to keep in mind, because one of the things that's always really stunned me is the conception of New Zealand as the good guys. The idea of wearing New Zealand jerseys. You know why people wore New Zealand jerseys? Because New Zealand continued to play South Africa. New Zealand continued to violate the Glen Eagles Agreement. New Zealand continued to sort of accommodate South Africa. They accommodated by not playing Maori players up really until the early 1970s. And so I find it interesting that there are so many New Zealand fans sort of festooned across South Africa in light of the fact that New Zealand at minimum accommodated the apartheid regime for an awfully long time. And really, 1985, they refused to tour, at which point the Cavaliers, which were pretty much the Springboks, the All Blacks in disguise. I mean, most of them were All Blacks and would have been All Blacks had New Zealand played. The country that gets the least attention, and I think that deserves it, and I don't know if I'll do that work or if someone else would, but really ought to be Australia. Because one of the things that we know about Australia is we don't know much about Australia from 1971 onward. Why? Because Australia's government and their sporting bodies said no more. We will not engage with South African sport. They had the tour in 1971 that descended into chaos. And at that point, Austrian officials were like, nope. And not only were they nope with regard to playing South Africa, part of the reason why the Springboks ended up going to the United States in 1981 was that Australia refused their airspace to the Springboks, to South Africa, which is to say you pretty much had to fly through the United States. So they flew through the United States on the way there. And then they flew to the United States and played 3 matches on the way back, in no small part because Australia had washed their hands of this. And I think a lot more work needs to be done because, for example, when you had the rebel tour of Australian cricketers, part of the reason that stood out so much was because Australian official sporting agencies had sort of washed their hands. And as someone who, since sort of living in South Africa for the first time, came to sort of hate Australian sports teams, I think they deserve to be revisited because despite some of the things, you know, the arrogance and the cockiness and all that, as if South Africans have any place to talk, by the way, that Australia is a really interesting story because their absence is the story in the 70s and 80s. And I think that's an important component to understand. From 1995, and I think that sort of we can leave 1995, what I've labeled the Invictus myth, and what both Mark and Praveen have covered reasonably well, and it's been covered ad nauseum, as simply 1995 and all that. Because we know what that has sort of meant symbolically, and we know how that's been overstated in terms of its historical significance. But the one figure who endured sort of between the before and after period, one of them was Louis Light. And Light's a fascinating guy because he was a rugby potentate, but his millions came from being a fertilizer salesman. And I've always argued that perhaps never in the history of humanity has there been a symmetry between a person and his job, as well as the bullshit salesman who was Louis Light. And Louis Light was a central figure in 1992 when the Springboks reemerged. And, you know, the ANC had put a number of conditions on playing Australia and on hosting Australia and sort of reviving South African rugby, even though they'd played New Zealand earlier. And those were, look, we're not going to play the national flag. We're not going to wave the national flag. We're not going to do the national anthem. We'll have a moment of silence. And they wanted people to visit Boipatong, where there'd been the infamous massacre, of course. And the Conservative Party, which had decided that the National Party simply wasn't right-wing enough, and with Louis Light sort of using his propaganda agencies, including the Citizen, but also a whole range of Afrikaans press, effectively scuttled that. And people sang the national anthem during the moment of silence. They waved the flag throughout the game. Louis Light at one point played a recorded version of the national anthem, and it was just a disaster. And at that point, the ANC, and again, to credit Australia, could have been in power. Effectively, Australia had a veto, and they said they basically would knock it off, not play next week if these conditions aren't met and respected, because it was a two-match series. And the ANC kind of flexed their muscles a little bit. And while Louis Light said he would not be bullied, he in fact completely caved in the next game. And the announcers at the game said, you know, look, the eyes of the rugby world are upon us. And so behave appropriately. And they did. Naturally, after 1995, there was no panacea. And one of the things I point out is that, and others, obviously, not just me, have pointed out, is that, you know, the idea that John Carlin's idea that the 1995 World Cup made a nation is just nonsense. From a pure sporting vantage point, the Bafana advancing to the Africa Cup of Nations and winning the African Cup of Nations was far more significant in sporting terms, in terms of what it meant to the country. Qualifying for the World Cup probably meant more than the 1995 World Cup did, but it allowed a certain level of self-congratulations in the rugby community. And it wasn't meaningless because of Nelson Mandela's embrace, because the symbols do matter. It wasn't meaningless, but I think it's been given way more meaning than it deserves as a historical sort of moment. And in all honesty, a probably more significant rugby moment was later that year, the game turning professional. And that's another area that still, I think, especially within the South African context, needs to be explicated because it's sort of one of those things recognized in the breach. That, in other words, professionalism was important. Now let's move on. In the period from 1995 until well beyond Eben Etzebeth, right, there were a number of incidents, whether it's Andre Markgraf, his dropping of the K-bomb in a recorded conversation, whether it's Gilles Grenier and his refusing to room or shower anywhere near Quentin David's, and a whole host of other events. You can sort of go on and on and on. And so that by 2007, when the Springboks win the World Championship again, with Brian Habana probably the most visible figure and the IRB Player of the Year that year, it almost had become sort of normalcy to expect success with something resembling a more, and I know Mark hates this term, and I don't love it, but transformed team, even though the problems continued, right? And Praveen Patel talked about this idea of quotas, which I think is easy to sort of demonize. It's amazing how the entire Dupriya family can seem to play for Sharks, and no one worries about quotas there, and yet every time Black players make it, they're accused of being quota players, and it's, these are oftentimes floating targets, and that whatever merit means. I mean, there are a whole host of conversations we had about this, and I and others have certainly written about this and the alibis and all the nonsense that goes into the politics surrounding South African rugby. And so these debates are playing along even as South Africa is sort of struggling to compete internationally, which they generally speaking obviously do, and also to do this thing, transform or whatever you want to, political change or representativeness or whatever. The case of Peter de Villiers is a fascinating one. I've gotten to know Peter a little bit, and I do believe he's been blackballed from the game. Yeah, look, he's quirky. Yeah, look, he's full of malaprops. Malaprops operating in a environment where he's expected to speak in both English and Afrikaans, and I think that's also been part of the issue. The fact that he's gotten minimal coaching opportunities in a world where you go from the Springbok coach, they're oftentimes soft cushions, especially given that Springbok coaches almost universally do the same thing. They win 53% of their games. That's what happens. And that's been the pretty much universal standard for the overwhelming majority of coaches. Those who have had success stand out, sometimes not because of their winning percentage, but because they timed it with a World Cup. And while de Villiers didn't win a World Cup, it's worth pointing out he did that rare thing of winning Tri-Nations, which South Africa hasn't been particularly successful at doing, either Tri-Nations or the Rugby Championship. It's been a rare thing. New Zealand has pretty much pressure washed the competition when it comes to that. Alistair Coetzee obviously was the second Black Springbok coach, using the sort of Biko-esque interpretation of Black. I know these terms can be problematic, and I recognize that. And his period was as a coach was not a success, although I think there were systemic issues for that too. His hiring was a nightmare, in light of the fact that almost everything connected to his hiring almost guaranteed that he'd fail. The hiring process took forever, and then suddenly he was thrust into the position with very little time to prepare. I feel like he wasn't given the opportunities to succeed. And then, of course, he is followed by Rassie Erasmus, who, by any stretch of the imagination, did an incredible job, and there's really no doubting that. The interesting component of South Africa winning the 2019 World Cup is that almost immediately the world shut down. And so South Africa is going to be on the back foot. And I am literally in the process of trying to finalize, I'll be writing a three-part series about the Lions, sort of as much historically but also contemporary. So arranging to get to the Lions matches this year. And I have a feeling that, England and Wales and Scotland and Ireland have been playing and South Africa hasn't. It's going to be really fascinating to see what happens when South Africa's lone warm-up game will be this weekend against Georgia. But I think that the COVID-19 pandemic has probably hurt South African rugby more than it has hurt anyone else, in a time when questions of core and periphery in rugby, so kind of strictly from rugby or global politics vantage point, has been, has become a bit sort of fraught, right? Because South Africa are the world champions, and in the game of sort of in the merry-go-round game of sort of, who belongs where, South Africa might actually be on the outside looking in, which is going to be really quite fascinating. There might be no more real Sanzar. Super Rugby has been completely changed, and I doubt it'll ever get back to being a 3 or 4 or 5 nation thing. South Africa seems to be somewhat unwanted guests in the European competitions. So it's going to be really interesting to see one of the 2 or 3 most powerful rugby nations on earth in terms of player performance, et cetera, sort of taking a back seat. And I find the Lions fascinating in that sense that, you basically need for countries to pile up every 4 years to be competitive against New Zealand, Australia, and South Africa. One can imagine what would happen to any given Northern Hemisphere nation if Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa combined to create one team. And I think these core periphery questions, moving away somewhat from race, but continuing with the question of colonialism, are really fascinating, because there really isn't the equivalent of India in cricket with regard to having so much power that they can't still be kind of bossed around by the old metropole. So I think that's a fascinating question that still needs to be revealed. And I'll be looking at that a little bit with the Lions stuff coming up. But I think that's a component of South African rugby going forward that is an absolute political question that at the same time will tie in some of South Africa's internal problems, but also showing the sort of external control of world rugby has a really interesting power dynamic, because quality and power don't fall in the same place. Southern Hemisphere really ought to be just simply the epicenter of world rugby, and it's not. The epicenter of world rugby still is kind of the six names. I think I'm going to leave it at that because I could go in a million different directions, but I feel like my colleagues covered a lot of the 1995 and 2019 stuff really well. And so I want there to be time for Q&A, and I think that this is a good stopping point. So thank you very much. And it's always great to be back part of the Sports Africa world, although I am very much looking forward to seeing all of you next time around. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. It was absolutely fantastic listening to you. Yeah, I'm excited for those questions to be answered. So, colleagues, we're going to move into the Q&A portion of the panel now. I will kick off with the first question, and I'll direct it to Mark. If one of the other panelists want to jump in after that, please feel free to do so. But I think Mark will be a good person to answer this. It's a question from Jorarai, and he or she asks, how diverse are the current South African rugby team, 7s, 15s, women, men? So how do you see the diversity in general, Mark, at this point in South African rugby?
Yeah, it depends on what you mean by diversity. If people are using the color spectrum as a yardstick for diversity, then I suppose the 7s team is diverse in that sense. The women's team is very diverse in that sense. South African 7s is very successful on the circuit. Our women's rugby less so. And it's because of the way South African rugby is structured. It plows enormous amount of energy and resources into the Springboks. And people have got to bear in mind that countries like Australia and England and Wales and New Zealand don't only cater for rugby union, they cater for rugby league as well. Australia, in fact, even plays, I think, three oval ball codes, including Aussie rules. I see New Zealand also has a version of it that they play. So their women's teams are involved in that. When you look at Australia, New Zealand, England, and so on. It's a totally different ball game when you look at what happens in South Africa in that sense. So if you, like I say, when people speak about diversity and they mean the optics, does it look changed? That skin color there, then I suppose you can say it is diverse. But in terms of morality and the morality of the anti-apartheid struggle, it's not diverse at all. In fact, it is same old, just in different skins. They even poured old wine into old skins, not even new wine. That's my answer.
Yeah, I mean, can I jump in?
Sure, anytime.
Okay, one of the things I would say is that we get so focused, and I do. We all, part of the dilemma of being a sports fan is you're wearing two different hats at various points, right? And I think Mark's exactly right. Look, the Springboks are going to take care of themselves. They're going to be the visible one. I'm trying to start my video. They're going to be the South Africans want to win. You're not winning the 2019 World Cup without Sia Khaleesi and Cheslin Colby and Beeston Tawarira and Bongi Mbomani. And I mean, you're just not doing it, right? And Pimpy. And I mean, that was an awesome team. And it was an awesome team that really, I think, did by and large do a good job of reflecting the, both quality and, whatever transformation or representativeness or whatever in South Africa. But the question is what's happening at the schools, where everyone loves to talk about quota systems and no one wants to be reminded that the white private school system was nothing if not an affirmative action program for Afrikaners in those rugby playing schools, right? That in other words, a lot of kids got to go to elite private schools who otherwise might not have been going to elite private schools for a long, 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 long time. So I think that the question becomes grassroots, which guys like me don't frankly spend as much attention to as we should, because we take a sort of springbok rugby, professional rugby down. And so I think that that's where those questions are. And that's where I think Mark is, both more on the ground than I am, but also where I think he's 100% right. That if you want to talk about changing face of rugby, it should be the thousands and thousands of kids playing and not like what's happening among the 23 on any springbok, game day.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Mark, I see your hand is up.
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay.
Yes, we can.
The problem is you have to look at the history in order to understand that question. You have to understand the history of the transition to so-called unity in South Africa in sport, where the anti-apartheid structures were completely dismantled at every level. So all the competitions, all the community competitions, women as well as men's competitions across the board in townships were completely dismantled. So you've created a sporting vacuum in townships across the country. And now you are using a symbol that was privileged by the systems created by colonialism and apartheid to be the symbol that is going to drag people out of that a mess that was created in order to liberate the Springboks. People must not think that the struggle against apartheid through sport was fought so that we could have black people playing in Springbok jerseys. I was not a great rugby player, but I played rugby for my club for many years, from 1982 till I didn't play long because I had to leave the game when I started working in Namibia, but from 1982 till about 1995, I stopped playing rugby. And I do not know of a single player of any region who ever aspired to be a Springbok during that period that I played with. And so it's a falsity now that is being presented as truth to make people think that the struggle in and through sport was so that we could have elite athletes there. The anti-apartheid sports struggle was about social justice and creating an equitable society. It only used sport as a vehicle to agitate for these changes. It was not about elitism in sport, not at all. The very people that Professor Akinde spoke about, your John Carlos and Tommy Smith and all these guys, those guys saw it. And they used their platforms then already. But we had those people here, and those are the very activists. Dennis Brutus was one of them. They are not mentioned because they cannot stand alongside what is presented now as nation-building truth. And that is the issue.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for that very comprehensive response. Parv, I want to move over to you. Nathan has asked a question on whether we should still, use and encourage the quota system, or should there rather be a system in place that encourages development from grassroots? So if you can take that for us, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me? Because I think that I cannot put the video on.
Yes, we can hear you.
So, well, the answer is of course that the best way is to uplift the grassroots structure, because the thing is that transformation is something, quota system is something that actually, okay, you can, as Mark said, you can actually see more Black players coming in, but they are quite forced rather than being implemented naturally, and so it means that those Black players have, as Mark said, been civilized and put into white schools such as Grey High School, Forsia Kolisi, and others, and other big structures. And that is how South African rugby union channels and finds its players. They go and look for those players in high school white institutions. So they're quite really in their comfort zone, and what they actually should do is actually get out of this comfort zone and go and encourage grassroots structures that have been destroyed, as Mark said, in the 1990s, just before South Africa reunited, and South African Rugby Union boards and union reunited as one union. So really the question is about recreating this grassroots community rugby so that those Black players can emerge naturally and not via a quota system.
Thank you, Parvin. Professor Katzam, a question from another gentleman is whether it seems to him, it sounds like that there was more social political activism between the 1950s and the 1990s, rather than there is today. So do you think this is the case? Do you think there's more? Do you think there's less? What is your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, look, there obviously was more because you have apartheid, and you have therefore an anti-apartheid struggle. I mean, that one of the things about protests is if you have something concrete like apartheid, as opposed to now where I think there's a great deal to stand up against, but you don't have necessarily the target. Yeah, there's more. The other thing we need to keep in mind in terms of change over time is that South African rugby in 1981 and South African rugby in 2021 are dramatically different things. And I think that we can lament the things that haven't happened and still celebrate the things that have, right? And so in that sense, there is less to protest compared to 1981 or 1971 or 1961, although that's a pretty low bar to leap over. So I mean, yeah, because you had apartheid. Now, in other places, however, there might be things to protest. In other words, despite what South Africans might think, South Africa isn't necessarily the planet around which the rest of the universe revolves around. And so in that sense, there might be real cause to protest elsewhere. And I think you're seeing that in various places, in Euro, and with the question of Germany lighting up the stadium in the face of decisions in Hungary and things like that. I think that a lot of the protests will be more targeted as opposed to something systemic like apartheid in South Africa, which is such an obvious and sort of big target. So yeah, there was more, but in the South African context anyways, I mean, of course there was.
Thank you, Prof. I appreciate that. Thank you for your answer. Mark, I have a question for you. So I think it's clear that there's a lot of disparity, with regards to race and racism, and even, there's a lot of instances where even kind of like racial segregation and racism has been detected in the Springbok team itself. So I'm curious, on a hypothetical note, how do you think this affects team dynamic, in the I want to say the dressing room, and I know it's a hypothetical question because we won't ever know, but from your experience, having studied rugby in South Africa, and also your experience as a former, even though it was a school rugby player, how do you think it affects the dynamic within the team?
Yeah, thanks, Lizanne. That's quite a difficult question to answer from my point of view, from my standpoint, because I've never been in their dressing room. But I would imagine that these chaps, like I say, they have absolutely every resource available to them that you could imagine. They have psychologists and physiotherapists and financial managers and nutritionalists and strength trainers and everybody. So you have people that are sort of streamlining them in terms of single thought and their role as nation builders. That's what I would imagine. So that, when the incident that happened between Quentin Davids and Gio Cronje a few years back, that type of incident won't happen very easily with a black captain at the helm. Siya Kolisi is the face of the Springboks now. He has replaced Nelson Mandela as the face of the Springboks, because Nelson Mandela was, before Siya Kolisi, the most famous black Springbok ever. So that I would imagine would be taken care of. And, everything is, how shall I say, is there for them. I've been privileged enough, a day before a match in 2014, I took students up to Ellis Park to see a rugby match between the All Blacks and the Springboks. And the team manager arranged for us to go into the Springbok dressing room. And I tell you, it's a sight to behold. There are the towels and everything. The room is plastered with Springbok posters all over the show, and slogans and all sorts of things, and energy bars and you name it. So I would imagine that I don't think that they would be troubled too much by issues of so-called race.
I am so jealous right now, you having been in a Springbok dressing room. That is very exciting.
Well, the interesting thing is, we asked the manager if we could go see what was in the All Blacks dressing room, and he said there's nothing to see. He said those guys come in, get dressed, go and play, come back. Richie McCaw and Dan Carter clean out the dressing room, and they get on the bus and they go. He said there's nothing there. There are no towels. They bring everything themselves. So, they're there to play rugby. Like Mike Tyson would walk out of the dressing room in his socks and his boxing shorts, no gown.
Yeah, for sure.
Can I answer?
Sure.
Can I answer Vanessa's question?
Please do.
In the chat?
Yeah, sure.
Not only do I not think Sia's appointment was a token, I never understood why Alistair Coetzee didn't appoint Siya a year earlier. Coetzee had a great record on the so-called question of transformation. Siya had been the captain for the Stormers with Eben Etzebeth as his vice captain, and instead Coetzee named Etzebeth captain in that France match and not Siya, and that was perplexing. So not only was it not token, it was long overdue. And the question going forward as to whether Kolisi will continue to be captain, I don't know. Because it depends on, frankly, what the new coaching staff is looking for. Because Kolisi is a fantastic player at a number of parts of the games, but sort of South African rugby folks tend to be obsessed with fetchers in the sort of flank position. And if there's a weak point to see his game, I suppose it's fetching on a relative scale. I also think that's a sort of overstated part of a flanks role. So, I mean, it depends on what they want going forward, but not only was it not token, it was overdue. And I'll tell you, the guys seem to absolutely love him. And I know these guys are well trained in the media and all that, but I don't think there's any question. I know I asked a number of the guys when they played in Washington and got to talk to them where, yeah, they're going to say the right stuff. But I asked 3 or 4 of the Springboks and they said, hey, no, we love him. We love him. We're so glad. We're so proud of him. So I don't see any element of tokenism at all. And in fact, I think it's the opposite. I think if anything, it was a year late in coming, though it worked out well because he definitely was the captain when they won the World Cup, and I think it might have been hard to sustain someone from, some of those teams from earlier on. So in that sense, Sia being captain in 2017 might well have been problematic for him being captain in 2019. But no, I do not see tokenism at all.
If I can also jump in. Yes, Vanessa, I wasn't asked that question. I was asked a similar question a few years back. I think it was 2015 or 2016. I was in England at the time. And somebody asked me, when do I think we will see a black Springbok captain? And I said that it will, and I say this with all due respect, I said it will happen when a sufficient crisis has built up within the Springbok structure, and once the civilizing process has been completed. I said one of the things that people hardly take any notice of is the political transition in this country, where, let's use sport as an example. Black people have been playing sport in this country since the 1870s. The ANC was established in 1912, and they came into power in 1994 with no experience whatsoever of having governed anything. And we had a black president, much loved all over the world and in South Africa. No questions were asked. But it took from the 1870s to 2019 for SA Rugby to have enough faith in a black player to make him a Springbok captain, their most prized brand. So that is how I look at the situation in South Africa. And the same with cricket. And many of us forget that Sean Plaatjes was a Springbok SA schools captain way back in 1993 or 94. Where is Sean Plaatjes now? So he was the first black captain of a South African rugby side, Springbok side, even though it was at a junior level. But nobody knows where he is. He's probably living in an RDP house in Mitchell's Plain somewhere. So from what I can see of Sia Kolisi and his playing style, very good player. But that is my view on the way race relations are playing out through sport in South Africa.
Thank you, Mark. Mark, there's been a statement, or a question for you also on the chat, and it's with regards to the two Springbok symbols, and the one is the Craven Springbok, and the other one is the different one. So the question for you is, would you agree that if we are using the Craven Springbok today, our nation building Springbok is the one meant for the whites?
Look, regarding the symbol, I don't think it matters which symbol we use. We could use a bunny painted in pink polka dots. It does not matter. The nature of the structure has not changed. You cannot build a nation or any structure from the roof down. You cannot have an elite stream dictating how a country must transform. And when we use transformation and we use these fancy terms for transformation and diversity, do we sit and think about the nature of South African society, where 239 of our municipalities, of those 239, or is it 249, only 18 are solvent? How many of those municipal management teams are diverse enough for us? Are they too diverse? Are they not diverse enough? What is happening? There is no technical app for a lack of morality. So I don't think it matters what symbol we use. Firstly, I think the Springbok is a symbol that cannot look at its own history. Its history and the history of apartheid struggle, anti-apartheid struggle, are completely incompatible. And the way it is presented in mainstream media specifically, colleagues here excluded, because everybody here delves very deep into the socio-political issues that face rugby. But the way it is presented in mainstream media, it is as if this is a system that is designed to save South Africa. Soccer, which is supposedly portrayed in many ways to be the sport of the black man, is not a nation. It has never been presented in any media form as a nation-building sport. Neither cricket, for that matter. Never, ever. Only rugby, and only Springbok rugby. And there has to be an answer as to why this is so. I don't have the answer, but it's a question that I have, you know, and we keep on promoting the Springbok in this way because it is our most successful institution.
Marvin, just you know, as a question for you, do you think there's a particular reason why rugby in South Africa is used as a nation builder and not really soccer or anything else?
And made it, you know, really its priority when coming into office in 1994, you know, to foster this team of a Springbok team, and did not choose the soccer team because there was perhaps less, it was less, how would I put it? It was not as successful as the Springboks, and the Springbok had a long history of success against New Zealand, against England, and for years, Springboks and All Blacks contest were, you know, the world championship in the world. So it really, I think it really gives a successful image of the nation, and that's why it has been taken over and over by political parties and politicians. I mean, you know, Nelson Mandela, the Thabo Mbeki in 2007, and now Cyril Ramaphosa. They really take on this success of the Springboks, you know, to make their own successes. So I think really it's about, you know, what Mark says about a successful image of the nation, and that what most countries want, you know, to show. They want to show the nation and the country as successful on the international scene. So it's just as Brazil would take soccer to show a brilliant image of their country. I think it really has to do with this. It's to the national successes of the team and the history of the team, which you know, brings South Africa on a map, brings New Zealand on a map, is rugby. You know, and that's why when we think about South Africa now, we actually think about the Springboks, and when we think about New Zealand, we think about the All Blacks. But when we think about Brazil, we think about football. So it really has stereotyped image in the media, and it's really gone into historical books. And I think it's something that's really has to do with a successful image of the nation. So that what I would say regarding this question.
Thank you, Parvin. Colleagues, on this note, I'm going to close the panel. Thank you to all our panelists, Professor Derek, Parvin, and Mark. You guys were excellent. It was great spending this time with you. To our tech team, thank you very much. It was an honor for me to present this panel. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, colleagues.
Thanks, everybody. I got to run to my last class of the summer term. I'll see you later this afternoon.
Yay.
Thank you.
My time, anyways.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Luzanne and colleagues. Great. I think it was a wonderful session, and we can tell with the amount of engagement that we're getting, even from people that are watching and joining us via YouTube and Facebook. Thank you so much and welcome again.